it would be hard for me to overstate how thrilled I am that we're doing this series. Like, I think if I tried to describe to you how excited I've been since we decided to do this series on Genesis 1 to 11, you would think I was exaggerating if I got into it. So I'm not going to get into it because it would just be weird. But part of the reason is because this passage, Genesis 1 to 11, as the prologue, as the introduction to the entire Bible, is so rich and so full and so life-shaping that you can return to it again and again and again, as I have for all the years that I've been a Christian, and especially since my years being a professor, where every year, at least for about 6 or 7 years, I would spend a month teaching this stuff to our undergraduate students. And as I would come back again and again, there was always more to see, and there was always more to see. And I know that's true of all the Bible, like all the Bible has riches in it, but for whatever reason, this passage, partly because it's that Genesis, it's that origin story, has so much that's rich and full. And so it's hard for me to overstate how excited I am to do it. The one lament I have in this series is that there is no way that we'll do it justice. There's just no way that we'll be able to see all the connections and draw all the implications and make all of the applications, but we want to make some progress. And so with God's help, let's turn to Genesis 1. As I reflected on what I could do in unpacking this passage, following up from Pastor Jonathan last week on God is bigger than you, it just struck me all of the different directions. I've been thinking all week about the fact that even that very first line, I kind of want to go back and preach more about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, because it's just such Jonathan last week said, this is one of the most important passages in the Bible. He just underlined its importance. And then I would want to come in and we could say, it's one of the most controversial passages in the Bible. And not for the reasons that you probably thought, which has to do with age of the earth and all that kind of stuff. The reason that this is one of the most controversial passages is that every command that God utters to human beings is rooted in the fact that he made the world. It's his world. You are his, and therefore he has the right to tell you what to do. So anytime anybody gets bent out of shape about what God says in the Bible to human beings, if you drill down far enough, where you will come to is Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and therefore he has the right to tell you what to do. And we could just unpack that. Or how about this one? This was the other sermon that I thought about giving, the one that I'm not going to give. We have Q&As if you want to follow up on some of this. That was why we instituted those Q&As. The other one was just those first 4 words. I remember there was a time when I was really doubting whether God existed, whether the Bible was true. And one of the things that so struck me about Genesis was the authority with which it opened. Like if I was going to write a religious book, okay, if I was going to try to start a religion, then one of the first things I would feel compelled to do would be to justify or prove the existence of the deity that I was going to worship. Like I would open up with an argument for the existence of God. Here's 3 reasons. Here's 5 ways. That's how Thomas Aquinas opens his Summa. Here's 5 ways you can know that God exists. And then you come to the Bible, and how does it open up? It opens up with a bolt from heaven. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. And what that tells me is that my mindset is this. I think that the world is the given. It's the thing that you just can't question. It's the thing that requires no explanation. It's just there. And then I think the world's just there. Now, is there a God? Does God exist? He's the question mark. But when you go to Genesis, that's actually backwards. God is the one who requires no explanation. He's just there. It's the world that says, where did it come from? How did all this stuff get here? This thing requires explanation, not him. And that's just a radical reversal of the way that I think about the world. And so there's a whole sermon there about how we got to reorient our minds and our hearts to put God at the first place and not put ourselves at the first place. But I'm not going to preach that sermon either. I just did. That was it. It would just been unpacking that for the next half hour. Instead, what I want to do is I want to focus in this sermon on the work of God's hands and the work of our hands. The work of God. That's how I've structured the sermon. The work of God's hands and the work of our hands. And so we're going to move from God's work on the 6 days to our continuing work as those made in his image. So let's begin by wrestling with a question about the relationship between Genesis 1:1 and the rest of the passage. There are two main options for how you can, so verse 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth. The earth was without form and void, and then we just launch into the 6 days of creation. And there are two main options that scholars will go to say, how does verse 1 relate to everything else that comes after? And so I'm going to give you these two options and explain why I pick the one I do. First, Genesis 1:1 could be a summary of what follows. So it would be verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and this is how he did it. Does that make sense? Like that would be a good way. You could see why that would be one way you could read the passage. Summary statement, this is what I'm about to talk about, and then here's me talking about it. The other way would be to see a sequence or progression from verse 1 to verse 2. So then it would sound like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the next thing he did was to focus in on the earth. You see that in the passage? So verse 1:1 is one act, and then verse 2 is the next act, is a second step beyond the first one. So there's a difference between saying, here's a summary, let me tell you how, and here's the first step, and then something else happens after the first step. There's a second step, and a third step, and a fourth step, and on we go. And we could fill up a sermon with arguments on both sides of that question. But in the interest of time, here's where I'm at. I think that in Genesis 1:1, I'm taking the progression or the sequence view. That verse 1 describes the first step in a sequence, and verse 2 begins a second step in a longer sequence. And the reason has to do, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is this. I think that verse 1 gives us the creation of a two-tiered or a two-part universe, a cosmos, all parts of creation in two parts, the heavens and the earth. And then in verse 2, it zeroes in and focuses in on what he calls here the earth. And one of the challenges is because different words he says the heavens are created in verse 1, and then down in verse 7 or 8, he says God called the expanse heaven, and it's the same word. And it gets confusing, like is there two heavens? How do we think about this? And I think the answer is yes, there are. In verse 1, we get the creation of the upper part of the universe and mention of the lower part. And then God zeroes in on the lower part, what he calls the earth. So the earth of verse 1 is the same as the earth of verse 2. Do you see that? There's no separation in the text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. So the earth of verse 1 and 2 is not yet distinguished into its various parts, what we know today as the cosmos. Meaning, it's an undifferentiated mass of some kind of created substance. And we can't say much more than that. All the Bible tells us is it's without form, so it's formless, it's empty, it's dark, and it's somehow watery, the space of the deep language. So if you picture God creating the heavens, and I'm going to tell you what I think that is in a minute, and then God creates the earth, and it's this formless, watery thing that doesn't have any parts to it yet. So what would be the heavens? The heavens, I would suggest, is what we normally mean by heaven. Not as in the sky, but as in the place where God lives. God's created residence, the place where the angels dwell, the place where in every other part of the Bible, when the prophet looks into the heavens, what does he see? Throne room, right? He sees angels singing. Think John in the book of Revelation or Ezekiel in his prophecies. You see the heavens, the invisible spiritual realm where God and the angels dwell. And I think what this passage is suggesting, right here at the beginning, is that when God created the world, he created heaven, where the angels live, instantaneously, all at once, fully formed, no construction project. But when it came to the earth, the place where man was to dwell, he took his time. He started with this, think of it like, and this is the best we can do because God does it out of his own head, but it's like there's a big ball of clay on the table, and there's nothing, it's just God. And then God says, let there be. God says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the heavens pops out fully formed, ready to go, and then there's a big blob. And then for the next 6 days, God goes to work on the blob. And he starts forming and shaping the blob into something magnificent. So, The passage moves in verse 1 from the totality of all of creation to focus on this formless, empty, and dark earth with the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And that language of hovering over the waters is meant to create, I believe, a sense of expectancy. What's going to happen? Will this formlessness be formed? Will this darkness be lit up? Will this void be filled with something? Will this emptiness be dealt with? And the rest of Genesis 1 answers those questions. God brings form to formlessness. He brings fullness to the void, and he begins by turning on the lights. Now, many scholars note how the rest of the passage, the 6 days of creation, are very tightly structured, very artistic in how they present themselves. You heard it as Larry was reading it. We got 6 days of work followed by a Sabbath day of rest. God's work week sets the pattern for our work week. You might have noticed, if you were paying attention or if you've studied this before, that the 6 days break down roughly into 2 panels, like 2 sides, day 1 to 3 and day 4 to 6. Did you notice that as you were reading through it? Meaning, on days 1 to 3, God brings form to formlessness. So you remember, the earth's without form. Well, for 3 days, he gives it form. He gives it structure. He divides it, separates it, puts this over here, that over there, and he makes it all stable. So the things that he creates on day 1 to 3 are all stable, firm places. And then on days, so that's the sky, which I think includes here outer space, all the way to the edges of the universe, the seas, the earth, all of those stable places God fixes, even the trees. They don't move, unless you're in Lord of the Rings. But in normal life, real life, they don't move. And so he fixes stable realms on days 1 to 3. And then on days 4 to 6, he fills it. So that emptiness, that void that was mentioned in verse 2, now God fills it with mobile occupants. Everything on days 4 to 6 moves. The sun moves, the moon moves, the stars, even they move, at least from where we sit and stand and watch. And then we get birds and fish and animals and man. Everything day 4 to 6 moves. And so there are these 2 panels. The earth is without form and void, and then God gives it form and fills it. Does that make sense? But it's not just that. There's even more than that. Those days begin to have intriguing parallels. I wonder if you noticed that. That day 1 matches with day 4. And day 2 matches with day 5. And day 3 matches with day 6. How so? Day 1, let there be light. And we get day and night, light and darkness. What happens on day 4? God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars to give light upon the earth. So light is the focus, light and darkness, regulating time is the focus of the first day and day 4. Day 2 and day 5, we get the creation of this sky and we get the creation of the waters below, right? The separation of the waters below. And then what does he do on day 5? So that's day 2. Day 5, what does he do? He fills them. He puts birds in the sky and he puts fish in the sea. And then what happens on day 3? He gathers up some dry land. And he makes plants come out of the ground. There's 2 acts, if you notice that, on day 3. And there's 2 acts on day 6. Again, they match. So day 2, you get land and you get plants. And then on day 6, you get beasts and man, both of whom live on the land and eat those plants. So again, there's this tightly structured artistry as you work through the passage. And in noting those, I just want to flag something for you. It's easy as you start to read to notice all of these patterns and these connections and these parallels, and you can tend to make it nice and neat, but there's outliers. And on most of the days, the pattern is God said, and it happened, and God named it, and he saw that it was good, right? If I said, what's the basic pattern? That's the basic pattern. Guess what? Day 2, he doesn't say it was good. Notice that? All the other days get, and God saw that it was good. Day 2, no statement about that it was good. Now we can infer and say, maybe it was good, but we're not told that. And so you have to ask why? Why leave it out? If you're making this nice, tightly structured parallel, why leave that out? And here's the deal. I have no idea. I have rough hypotheses, maybe. I've read some medieval theologians who have some crazy ideas about why God doesn't say that the second day was good. But there's these outliers in there. It doesn't quite fit into our nice, neat little boxes, which what does that do for me? It presses me back in. Look again, look again, look again. Okay, regardless of those details, the overall movement of this passage is clear. Verse 2 gave us an earth that was formless, empty, and dark. God spends 6 days separating, dividing, evaluating, approving, forming, and filling. And at the end of 6 days, we don't have a formless earth. We have an ordered cosmos filled with life and light and blessing. What's more, many biblical scholars argue, I think persuasively, that God here in Genesis 1 is building a temple. That the creation itself is a temple. And the reason they think that is because later when Israel builds its temple, it builds its temple as a replica of Genesis 1. And so if you think about in the temple, there's a big curtain that has jewels in it, and that looks like the night sky with stars in it. If you think about what's around the edge of the temple, it's all of this gold plating that's in the shape of pomegranates and other trees, and it's like a garden. And then there's this one tree, a lampstand that has 7 branches coming off. It looks like a tree that most scholars think is a replica of the tree of life. Okay, and so there's this garden imagery, there's this sky imagery in the temple, and what's more, we know that in the ancient world, temples were often dedicated in 7 days. And so we have a 7-day temple dedication. And so scholars know that what God seems to be doing on these days is he's building a house for him to live in. This is going to be God's house. Creation is meant to be his house, and he spends 7 days building it. So that's the great work of God's hands. 7 days of work, 6 days of work, followed by a day of rest. The work of his fingers, as Psalm 8 says. And then God's going to transition to focus on the work of our hands. And so we have the work of God's hands. Now I want to talk about the handoff, and then the work of our hands. What's the handoff? You need to recognize a few movements. I wonder if you noticed these as we were reading through it. We've seen the movement from chaos and order, formless to ordered, empty to filled, darkness to light, but there's another movement. There's a movement of delegation. Did you catch that when you were watching it? So on the first 3 days, listen to how God talks. God said, "Let there be light." There was light. Notice, by the way, this would be a Q&A kind of discussion. It doesn't say that light was made or created. It just says it was. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. On the other times, God said, "Let there be an expanse," and God made the expanse. Is there significance to that at all? There might be. Ask in the Q&A. We can talk about that. So God said, "Let there be light." Boom, there was light. God said, "Let there be an expanse." God made the expanse. God said, "Let dry land appear," and it was so. You see how just immediate it is? But notice what happens on day 3. This is down verse 11. God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit." Verse 12, the earth brought forth vegetation. Notice how the earth becomes involved in the creative process. God doesn't do it directly. He doesn't just say trees and boom, trees pop into existence. He says, "Earth, get going, bring trees out of the ground." And the earth brings forth trees. Or again, look at day 4. We've had 3 days of evening and morning, of alternating periods of light and darkness. And then on day 4, God creates luminaries, light bearers, these great lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And he sets them in the heavens, like jewels, to rule the day and rule the night. In other words, he delegates the task of regulating times and seasons to the greater and lesser lights, which incidentally, people always get tripped up about the fact, how could there have been day and night, periods of light and darkness with no sun? If the sun's not made till day 4, how was there day, evening, and morning on the first 3 days? And I think that's not a problem at all. For 3 days, God was the light shining, and the earth was rotating. He was shining from a direction, and it was rotating. And then on day 4, God said, "Hey, sun, moon, stars, take over." He delegates the task of giving light to his light bearers. So again, we have a movement from God does it immediately to God involves creation. And then, of course, we get the premier example on day 6 with the creation of man. God gives man dominion over fish, birds, and beasts. Another little thing on when the waters swarm with living creatures, he created the sea creatures, every living creature that moves, which the waters swarm. There's a line where it talks about when it mentions the kinds of sea creatures, it mentions like these great sea creatures. The Hebrew word's tannin. It's like the great sea monsters. But when it's told what man has dominion over, they're left out. And it's just, again, one of those little details, like, do we not have dominion over the great sea monsters? And it's like, maybe we could get that. That'd be cool, right? But so there's these little details in the passage. Again, you have to pay close attention. I don't know why I mentioned that. It's just one of those cool things that I think about. Okay, just as the sun and the moon will rule the heavens, man will rule the earth and seas. Okay, so in other words, the point is there's a movement of delegation with God doing things directly and then using the world that he's made to take over tasks that he did for the first few days. It's a movement of delegation. So God is, we saw the work of God's hands, and then here's God handing off to man. God gives authority and responsibility to his creatures so that by the end of day 6, as Larry read in day 7, God's work of creation is finished. He's done. But our work is only beginning. Our work is only beginning. When God's work ends, his work of creation, our work begins. So that brings us to this question. What does it mean for us to be created in the image and likeness of God? This is our focus on the work of our hands. Now, that's a sermon series in itself, right? That's a huge question. What does it mean to be made in God's image? But let me give what I think is the most basic and obvious answer and then fill it out in 3 ways. Being made in God's image means that we show in a unique way what God is like. It's very simple. You don't have to make it more complicated, I don't think, than it is. It means you show what God is like. Some people make it really complicated about what aspect of man, and it's just, you image God. You are like God. Now, in one sense, everything's like God. Everything shows what God is like. The heavens declare his glory. But in a special sense, man reflects and represents God in the world. This language of image, it's like we are God's statues. God has filled the world with little replicas of himself that are meant to show in a particular high way what he is like. God is a seeing God, so he gives you eyes. God is a hearing God, so he gives you ears. He is a making and forming God, so he gives you hands. So God sees and hears and makes, but he himself has no eyes, has no ears or hands, at least physical ones. And so he gives eyes, ears, and hands to us so that we can represent what he is like. We are made in his likeness. So that's the most basic answer. Human beings are created to image, reflect, and represent what God is like. But I think we can flesh this out a little bit more. And the way to do it, I think, is to look in these first 2 chapters of Genesis and note the jobs that man is given. Note the tasks. What is he commanded to do? And by looking at what man's vocation, his calling is, we can see further dimensions of what man is intended to be. You get that? Look at what man is intended to do, and we can understand what man was intended to be. And I've got 3 things that I want to highlight about what man was intended to do. 3 dimensions of man's calling. Number 1, man is a priest. Number 2, man is a king. Number 3, man is a prophet. Priest, king, prophet. How do we see those in Genesis? You might say, I know like Leviticus might talk about priests, but does Genesis? Well, we see man's priestly calling in Genesis 2:15. Now, we didn't read this, but you can flip over and look. This is after God has formed this garden and he's placed man in it. And it says, verse 15, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So there's a task. Work the garden, keep the garden. And those words there, at a basic level, just refer to probably agricultural work. Work and keep the garden. The way a gardener works the garden, that's how you're to work the ground, Adam. They're common Hebrew words. The 2 words here for work and keep, they show up everywhere in the Bible. However, they rarely show up together. And when they show up together, it's in particular contexts. Want to guess what those contexts are? When these 2 words, work and keep, show up together, most other places in the Bible, it refers to the duties of Levites and priests in the tabernacle. They are to work the tabernacle and guard the tabernacle. They're to minister in the tabernacle, and they're to keep and protect the tabernacle or the temple. So Numbers 3 would be one place where it shows up, Numbers 8, Numbers 18. Whenever God wants to talk about the duties of Levites in the tabernacle, these 2 words show up together. Otherwise, they show up separately. And they mean work and keep in a generic sense. But when they're together, there seems to be this special thing. And if you think about it, if this world is God's temple, right? If God is making a temple in 6 days and resting on the 7th, then we need priests in the temple to work and keep and guard the sacred space. And so what does God do? He sets man in the garden, in the sanctuary, to worship God and obey God and protect the garden, to guard the garden, to protect the sacred space. That's the first task man is given. That tells us something about what he is. He's a priest because he's supposed to protect sacred space. Second, not only is he a priest, but he's a king. This one's the most obvious. When God says to subdue the earth and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, that's royal language. That's what kings do. Kings have dominion. Kings rule. Kings subdue their enemies. In this case, it's not an enemy, it's the earth. Note two things about this call. Okay, just think about this. If God says, Adam, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, that implies that much of the world, in fact, I would say all of the world outside of the garden that God planted, all of it is unsubdued and untamed. Does that make sense? Like, if God says to man, subdue the earth, the implication is earth isn't subdued yet. There's a job to be done. There's a direction to go. I've given you this garden, this haven, right? This little bitty holy place in the midst of this vast world. And I've said, protect it and keep it. And then he turns around and he says, extend it. Make the world like the garden. Or maybe even more. Can we say this? The trajectory of the whole Bible is from a garden, Genesis 1 and 2, to a garden city, Revelation 22. Was man called always from the very beginning to turn the world not just into a garden, but into a garden city filled with green spaces and garden-like environments, but also mining the earth and building things and building vast cathedrals and building all sorts of things that would reflect who God is and what he is like. I think it's likely. So, God calls the man to make the world like the garden, and this is a kingly call, to extend sacred space so that the earth is filled with the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Number 3. So he's a priest, guard and protect the sacred space. He's a king, extend the sacred space and rule over the earth. And number 3, he's a prophet. And we see this in Genesis 2:19 to 21, which Jonathan's going to focus more on next week. With the man and woman and how that all works. But in Genesis 2:19, Adam is given the amazing task of naming the animals and of naming the woman. And it's hard for me to overstate the significance of this reality. So if you think about it, on the first days of creation, do you notice what God did? God had separated stuff, and then he named it. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. He called the expanse heavens. He called the gathered waters seas. He called the gathered land earth. He named everything, right? God had separated it and then named it. And then here, in the midst of day 2, he turns to man and he says, now you do it. You name stuff. Just think about how amazing this is. Like when we teach kids how to speak, what do? You get a little board book, an alphabet board book, and you bring it to your 1, 2, however old kid. You start doing it before they can even engage at all, but you're doing it. And what do? You open it up and you point at that red fruit and you say over and over again, apple, apple, apple. And then you turn the page and you point at the spherical toy and you say ball, ball. And then you turn the page and you see the whiskered animal and you say cat, cat. Right? That's how you do it with kids. Here's what God does in the beginning. He brings the board book to Adam and says, what do you want to call him? Like in chapter 2, verse 19, it says, whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. What do you want to call this, Adam? He's making it up. He's coming up with it. He's having to attend and pay attention. And we could talk more about how when he gets to the naming of woman, he gives reasons for his names. There's so much in this idea of naming. But what does this suggest? It suggests that we're to be prophets. We're meant to faithfully name God's world, to faithfully call it what it is, and to draw out what it is by what we name it. There's a whole sermon series in that too. So here's the picture we get in Genesis 1. Let me step back, and then we're going to move briefly to application. God creates a good world, and over the course of 7 days, he makes it very good. But then God rests on the seventh day, but man does not. God gives him a threefold task. Work and keep the garden, priest. Fill the earth, subdue and have dominion, king. Faithfully name, prophet. This movement from the work of God's hands to the work of our hands is just earth-shattering in its implications. Listen to this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes from Robert Farrar Capon. He's an author. Just listen to it, okay? Why do we marry? Why take friends and lovers? Why give ourselves to music and painting and chemistry or cooking? Out of simple delight in the resident goodness of creation, of course, but more than that. Half of Earth's gorgeousness lies hidden in the glimpsed city it longs to become. For all of its rooted loveliness, the world has no continuing city here. It's an outlandish place, a foreign home. It's a session on the way to a better version of itself, and it is our glory to see it so and thirst until Jerusalem comes home at last. We are given appetites not to consume the world and forget it, but to taste its goodness and hunger to make it great. That's what God calls us to in Genesis 1 and 2. Take the rooted loveliness of the world, what he made, guard it, protect it, and then, wonder of wonders, make it lovelier. We're to taste the goodness of the earth's givenness, and we're good to make it greater. God moved the world from good to very good, and he hands it to man and says, make it greater. With my help, make it greater. That's what I want you to see in Genesis 1. The work of God's hands handed to us so that the work of our hands and with his grace, his work can be transformed from one degree of glory to another. So many directions we could go by application. I won't have time to get to them all, but let me just mention two briefly. The first is this underscores the dignity of your work. The amazing dignity. Doesn't matter what you're doing. Like, it doesn't matter whether you are a student or a teacher or a homemaker or a cop or an engineer or a nurse or a photographer or a customer service rep or a financial analyst. It does not matter what your labor is. It flows out of this, and there's incredible dignity in it. As an image bearer, you are co-laboring with God in drawing out the resident goodness of his creation, because what God has done is he's embedded in the world, not just in the earth. It's easy to think about it in physical terms. Like, God has made, let's see all the amazing things hydrogen can do. And there's chemists and scientists who try to figure that out. But that's true not just of physical stuff, but of relational stuff and economic stuff. All of it has amazing potential, and it's the task of man to draw out those hidden possibilities in order to bless and love other people and give glory and honor to God. So one of the fruits of this sermon, I hope, is that you begin to see your work in a new light as an expression of some aspect of your calling to bear God's image. So those aspects of your work, think about whatever you do, those parts of your job where you're just trying to maintain and protect the good that you already have, that reflects priestly kind of vocation. I'm protecting and guarding what's already here. Those aspects of your job where you're looking at the next stage, just outside the boundaries, just over the horizon, and you're trying to launch into it to make it greater, that's kingly, subduing, taking dominion, ruling over a new territory. And then those amazing times when you see what nobody has seen before. It's not just that there's an untamed wilderness. It's nobody's imagined this yet, but you call it into existence by your imagination and your creativity. You're a prophet. You're seeing the unseen. You're seeing what nobody else can see. And so there's aspects of your job, all of you, that are like that. And I want to encourage you to begin to see your job that way, however mundane you may think it is. All right, so when you receive what God has done in the world and you study it in light of God's character and the scriptures, and you learn his works and you apply your creativity and your imagination and your blood and sweat and tears, you draw out from God's work something more than what was there before. And when you do that, you are glorifying the work of God. And I mean that. You're glorifying it. And there's two ways we use the word glorify. When we say that we glorify God, what we mean is not that we make him glorious, but that we ascribe the glory that he already has. We acknowledge it, we see it, we testify to it. That's how we glorify God. We don't make him more glorious. When we glorify his work, we mean it like we do with the word beautify. Beautify means make beautiful. Glorify in that second sense means make it glorious. Your work should make God's work glorious by drawing out the potential he's placed within it, by seeing the trajectories and the patterns that he's built and then bringing them out for the good of other people. And I know that's difficult for some of you. I just want to encourage you to stick with it, labor to see it. Final thing, if your work has great dignity, it also means there's a great danger. Because we don't live in a Genesis 1 world. We live in a Genesis 3 world. We live in a world that's been cursed. In particular, our work has been cursed. It's difficult. It's vanity. It's vexation, according to Ecclesiastes. And not just the work itself, but we ourselves are sinners, which means that you can approach your work wrongly. And the reason I organized the sermon around the work of God's hands and the work of our hands is because I wanted you to feel this, because there's two ways that phrase, the work of our hands, is used in the Bible. One of them is like this: let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, establish the work of our hands. Yes, Lord, establish the work of our hands. Psalm 90, verse 17. Bless the work of our hands, all throughout Deuteronomy. Second way: in the days to come, evil will befall you, because you will do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger through the work of your hands. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands. Do not go after other gods to serve and worship them, or provoke me to anger with the work of your hands. That's Deuteronomy 31, Jeremiah 25, and Isaiah 2. So there's two options. This is where I'm going to close. There's two options. You can either take your work and you can offer it back to God in worship, or you can worship your work. It's going to be one of those. You're either going to take the work God gives you and see it as an expression of your identity as a priest, a king, and a prophet made in his image, or you're going to take your work and you're going to bow down to it. And you're going to try to find your ultimate value, your ultimate significance, your ultimate purpose, your ultimate worth in what you do. But you cannot find your identity in your little v vocation. You can only find it in your big V vocation as an image bearer of God and a renewed image bearer of Christ. Which brings me to the table. The work of Christ is the finished work of God. We've talked about work of creation and our work of cultivation. Now we have to talk about the finished work of Christ. Christ is the true priest entering the sanctuary on our behalf. He's the true king, subduing his enemies and ours under his feet. And he is the truth prophet, calling us his own and giving us a new name. So I'm going to invite the pastors to come. And as they do, I want you to think, this table, this is amazing. This table actually may be the most helpful thing you can meditate on in terms of this sermon. Because I want you to think about what's happening here. This table and its elements represent the finished work of Christ. His body broken for you, his blood shed for the forgiveness of your sin. But how does God represent the finished work of Christ to us? Through the work of his hands, glorified by the work of our hands. Think about it. We do not remember Jesus with grain and grapes. We do it with bread and wine. But what is bread? Bread is grain, but glorified by human hands. What is wine? Wine is grapes, but glorified by human hands. And so at this table, we see God's work in creation, grain and grapes. We see our work of cultivation, bread and wine. And both of those are meant to, what do? We see through those and we see finished work of Christ, true priest, true king, true prophet in our place. We've got the bread. We'll bring that around to you. His body is the true bread. Let us serve you.